This is Edward Segal. Welcome to the Crisis Ahead podcast. Each week, we look at how companies, organizations, and individuals in the news are responding to, managing, or recovering from a crisis, and what you can learn from their successes or failures. My observations and recommendations are based on my experience managing crisis situations and advising others on how to respond to and bounce back from disasters, scandals, and other emergencies. My guest this week is Gary M. Ross, president of Inside Comms. He'll be here shortly to talk about the role of internal communications in a crisis. But before Gary joins me, I want to say something about Google and lawsuits. Last week, the U.S. Department of Justice filed an antitrust lawsuit against Google. As reported by the New York Times, the lawsuit accused Google of illegally protecting its monopoly in search and search advertising by obtaining several exclusive business contracts and agreements. A lawsuit, of course, can create a crisis for any organization that is being sued. If your company is sued and news organizations do stories about the lawsuit, it will be important to get your side of the story out to the public right away. That's exactly what Google did when it immediately issued the following statement after the federal lawsuit was filed. Google said that, quote, "Today's lawsuit by the Department of Justice is deeply flawed. People use Google because they choose to, not because they're forced to or because they can't find alternatives. We will have a full statement this morning," unquote. I've written a new book that includes important advice on how you should communicate about a crisis and manage and recover from more than 100 different kinds of crisis situations. Crisis Ahead: 101 Ways to Prepare for and Bounce Back from Disasters, Scandals, and Other Emergencies. Crisis Ahead is now available as a paperback book wherever books are sold and as an ebook from Amazon and Barnes & Noble. Crisis Ahead is filled with case studies about how companies and public figures have prepared for and handled crisis situations, and the important lessons you can learn from their successes and failures. The book also includes checklists and exercises to help you get ready for and react to a crisis. You can learn more about the book at publicrelations.com. It's not too early to start preparing for the next crisis. That's because history shows there is always a next crisis, and the sooner you are ready for it, the better. Gary M. Ross is president of Inside Comms, a training, coaching, and consulting firm focused on internal communication. Over his 30-plus year career, Gary has worked as a consultant, corporate executive, and Emmy-nominated broadcast journalist. He also led corporate public relations for Chicago-based Hyatt Hotels Corporation. Welcome to the show, Gary.
Thank you, Edward. It's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Internal communications, of course, are a very important part of responding to a crisis. Are there some companies that you think have done a better job in communicating with employees during the pandemic?
Yeah, it's these times have really shown, I think, how valuable internal communications can be for an organization. Internal communications really has had to step up, and it's become a lot more visible in an organization. And I think leaders are really seeing the value of the function in the organization, perhaps in ways that they hadn't before. Having said that, though, I think if you look at what some companies have done really well lately, you kind of go to the usual suspects. So Southwest Airlines, if you had seen it, they posted this online. Their CEO Gary Kelly had sent an email out to employees. I believe it was a couple of months ago. It was the end of July, and he kicked it off. The first line in the email is up front. It says up front, "I want you all to know we will not furlough or lay off any Southwest employees on October 1, unlike our major competitors." And that's not only a piece of good news, and he wanted to share that up front, but it really acknowledges that when you're communicating to people from the C-suite, from the senior management level, that people are thinking about, what does this mean for me? What's in it for me? When they're reading these communications, so they do want to hear things about business strategy and so forth. And Gary Kelly goes on further into his email talking about that. but it's a real acknowledgement of what people are thinking about when they're reading these communications, when they're really when they're walking in the door every day or firing up their computer every day to work remotely. What is happening to my job? What does this mean for me, for my family? I have a mortgage to pay, and so forth. And what does this mean for me? So this, just the fact that he led that email off with that line shows that there's some real empathy there and some real understanding for what people are going through. And I thought that was terrific.
Well, that's a good example of the way to do it right. Are there examples of other companies that are not doing such a good job with their internal communications?
I think that if you look back at some of the social justice issues that have been at the forefront in the last couple of months, you're seeing some companies that are coming out and talking about commitment to diversity, commitment to social justice, and so forth. But then you go back and you look at either their executive ranks or their board of directors, and you see that there really isn't much diversity or commitment to diversity there uh, that they say that they have. So it's a little disingenuous for some of these companies that have come out and said that. So I think you need to be careful with what you're saying you're committed to and what you're promising folks, because you got to back that up with your record and with who you are as a company. And if for some reason you're looking back and you don't like what you see, it's time to be authentic and say so, and say, look, hey, we haven't been as committed to this as we have as we should have been in the past. We understand that, we own that, we're going to be accountable for that, and we're going to make sure that we do better in the future. And I think that some companies did that, but there are others that I think just kind of saw this as one of those moments where they come out and they say, "Oh yeah, we take this very seriously," and gave a standard statement, and it kind of felt flat. And in a lot of ways, it had the opposite effect of what they wanted.
So, walk me through the steps that companies should take to ensure that they are conducting their internal communications the right way.
Well, it's important to remember to have that empathy, to put yourself in the employee's shoes, and of course, a lot of people who are working on these corporate communications are employees themselves, and they likely know a lot of people personally affected or even harmed by a crisis. If we step out of the COVID world for a second, if there's some sort of environmental accident in a community, they're part of that community too. So they may know people. They're also their own employees are going to be concerned about what's happening. They might be grieving if unfortunately there was a fatality. So it's important to acknowledge their pain and concern that they might have to this, and also show that the CEO and the leadership team shares that concern as well. It's important to offer support and counseling depending on the situation. People want to know their organization is being authentic and upfront and honest, and doing the right thing. People can perhaps forgive a mistake if they understand that the company's heart is in the right place and leadership's heart is in the right place. So emphasizing your commitment to doing the right thing in a difficult time, I think is very important to communicate to your people. Having said all of that, they also want to know what the business impact is, and I think you got to be careful here. There were some companies, especially in the beginning of COVID, that over communicated perhaps on the effect that the COVID crisis was going to have on their business, and didn't communicate enough on the impact that it was going to have on individual people. So you definitely want to communicate about the business impact of the crisis. What does this mean? What are we doing to make sure that the ship is stable, so to speak, in the wake of this crisis? Just don't do it at the expense of the human side of the crisis as well. We want to make sure that we're also communicating internally, making sure that we're understanding that we're communicating to all the relevant audiences that we need to. We just don't want to be communicating to office folks or remote workers. If there's manufacturing people or people out in a retail environment, a dispersed workforce. We want to make sure we're getting to them too. And also keep in mind that, especially in a crisis when things are a little disturbing, employees' families are a very important audience. When people, especially if a crisis is in the news, when people are going home and they're sitting around the table having dinner, they want to be able to tell their families that their company is doing the right thing in a crisis. So those audiences are important as well.
From your perspective, Gary, who are the best people in an organization to write these emails and be in charge of internal communications? What should they be doing before they push send and send those emails?
Well, I think you want to engage the communication folks, and specifically folks that are specializing in internal communications. They're going to be the most familiar with the audiences, have their ear to the ground, so to speak, to be able to address any particular issues that come up. And I think being able to, especially if the crisis is particularly severe, being able to literally sit down if you're in an office situation, or get on a video call with the CEO and senior leaders, and really be able to have an honest conversation and hash out a statement, an email, messaging, talking points, so forth, on something that's not only going to do the job, but also is authentic, and that people are going to take the right way. That means being able to speak in real time to the CEO and suggest alternatives to what the CEO perhaps initially suggested. Say, well, we could say that, but it might be better to say such and such because there's an audience that's particularly concerned about that. To be able to have frank conversations with senior management is very, very important. What to do before you hit send? It is important to engage the legal department. I think most of the time I've worked with legal departments, they've been very understanding in these cases, but they're going to be aware of some things that we may or may not want to be saying in these types of statements. So it's important to make sure that they're engaged. Just don't let them take over with stilted language and so forth. It's also good to speak with HR. There might be some things that they're aware of that need to be addressed, and especially if we're dealing with a dispersed workforce, people out in the field, at a retail location, in a factory, that the head of those folks, or people that are specifically in tune with that audience, are consulted as well, because they're going to be aware of some specific concerns that people might have.
A lot of companies don't have a crisis management plan, and even if they do, they may not have practiced it for quite a while. What do you think they should do to build internal communications into those plans and to test it to make sure it works when a crisis hits?
Yeah, well, if they don't have a plan, I would advise that they begin to put one in place. Even the framework of a plan is better than no plan. Uh, there should be some degree of a continuity plan in an organization, let alone a crisis communication plan. So tapping into those resources, I think, is important. But in the absence of that, it's having that open channel to senior leadership and the right people who are depending on the part of the organization where the crisis is taking place, having access to those folks and be able to act and make decisions in real time with people with that decision authority.
What's the best way to send internal communication messages?
Yeah, it depends on the organization and the workforce. If you've got a dispersed workforce, it's important, I think, to have some sort of mobile capability. Everybody's got a mobile device these days. So whether it's an emergency communication system, some sort of mass notification system, the companies are using these days. If you may be familiar with these, when if your kids are at school and there's a snow day or a weather-related closing, you'll get an automated phone call. A lot of companies are doing the same thing now and having those systems in place. If you're office-based, email is always good, but companies really vary on the degree to which they use internal communication tools, whether it's Yammer or Slack or some other kind of internal messaging. So whatever the company uses, one of those foundational rules of communication is go to where the people are. So wherever the people are, whatever the people are using, that's what you want to use.
Well, do you have any other items on your list, Gary, of internal communications do's and don'ts?
Well, the overriding thing is know your audience, be authentic, be empathetic, and communicate with the knowledge that people on the other end are wanting to know what things mean for them, wanting to know what this means not only for their job but really kind of for their world, for their family, for their career, and their work life. So keeping that in mind always, I think you'd do pretty well. I'm working right now on a suite of internal communications training. It's online at insidecoms.com. And we talk a lot about that in those training courses, about that authenticity, that empathy that is really needed.
Well, tell us more about your company and your services.
Yeah, so we're at www.insidecoms.com, and we do training, consulting, and coaching for internal communications. Currently developing a full suite of e-learning specifically for internal communication pros. And if you want to go directly to that page, you can go to plus.insidecoms.com. We call it Inside Comms Plus, and it's a suite of internal communications training courses. They're quick, they're affordable, they're about an hour each, and you can do as little or as much as you like. We're in the process. We have some of them that are live and available now. We're in the process of rolling out more before the end of the year. So definitely check that out, plus.insidecoms.com.
Thanks for being on my show this week, Gary. My guest has been Gary Ross, president of Inside Comms.
Edward, it was a pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks for joining me for this episode of the Crisis Ahead podcast. Remember, it's not a matter of if companies and organizations will have a crisis, but when.